Okay. Um, my name is John Harker. I'm a fifth-generation descendant of Betsy Ross. During the past few years, I have considered the legend and how it became so overwhelmingly popular, and I've tried to find supporting documentation for it. I have also evaluated the evidence for the role of Francis Hopkinson, and I believe what I have is inconclusive on that. What I am going to cover herein is previously little known and unknown evidence dating from before Canby's speech of 1870, which strongly suggests that Betsy was involved in the creation of our earliest flags, and that this evidence shows Betsy Ross as a well-known individual during her lifetime, which is much earlier than the 1870 William Canby lecture to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This celebrity, which she appeared to have become, is strong support for what had been until now considered only a family myth. While the matter of who made the first American flag remains undetermined, government records do document Betsy's work making flags over a career of nearly 40 years. The first record of her government-ordered flag making appears in the minutes of the State Navy Board of Pennsylvania for 29 May 1777, which describes an order on William Webb to Elizabeth Ross for 14 pounds, 12 shillings and 2 pence for making ship's colors put into Richard's store. She continued in the flag-making business well until at least 1815-16, when government letters document her filling orders from the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for presentation flags. Now I would like to give you a little background on Canby's speech. Public awareness of Betsy Ross has long been thought to have begun in 1870 with a speech by her grandson William Canby, my grandfather's uncle, to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, in which he described how she came to sew the first American flag for a committee, the committee being George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross. Sitting sewing in her shop one day with her girls around her, several gentlemen entered. She recognized one of these as the uncle of her deceased husband, Colonel George Ross, a delegate from Pennsylvania to Congress. She also knew the handsome form and features of the dignified yet graceful and polite Commander-in-Chief, who, while he was yet Colonel Washington, had visited her shop both professionally and socially many times, a friendship caused by her connection with the Ross family. They announced themselves as a committee of Congress and stated that they had been appointed to prepare a flag, and asked her if she thought she could make one, to which she replied with her usual modesty and self-reliance that she did not know, but she could try. She had never made one, but if the pattern were shown to her, she had no doubt of her ability to do it. The committee, which she said they should be in lines or in some adopted form as a circle or a star, and that the stars were 6-pointed in the drawing, and she said they should be 5-pointed. That the gentlemen of the committee and General Washington very respectfully considered her suggestions and acted upon them. General Washington seated himself at a table with pencil and paper, altered the drawing, and to the suggestions of my mother. That General Washington seemed to her to be the active one in making the design, the others having little or nothing to do with it. Now this story, which can be documented as well as he could through family affidavits and other research, is actually now supported by other new evidence. This evidence will show that others knew of this story and of Betsy's role both during and after her lifetime, and it has Rebecca Prescott Sherman supports the family story. Independent corroboration of Betsy making a flag for Washington has recently resurfaced. In Founding Mothers, Cokie Roberts quotes a story about Rebecca Prescott Sherman that first appeared in the Journal of American History in 1909. This article, which discusses the early Prescott family and recounts events from the life of Rebecca Sherman, was written by a descendant, Kate Bennett, based on the recollections of Rebecca's niece. Rebecca was the second wife of Roger Sherman from Connecticut, a drafter of the Declaration of Independence. Rebecca's niece recalled that Rebecca learned from her husband that George Washington was having a flag made by Betsy Ross, and nothing would satisfy Aunt Rebecca but to go and see it in the works. And there she had the instance of somebody outside Betsy's family describing her connection to George Washington and the making of our first flag. While hearsay, its credibility is bolstered by the niece's recollection of another incident in the life of Rebecca Sherman. Rebecca and her husband attended a dinner party given by George Washington, who invited Rebecca to sit beside him as being the handsomest lady there that evening. The niece gave Kate Bennett a piece of green silk from the dress Rebecca wore that night, and the silk cloth was subsequently sewn into a quilt by a group of ladies in Minnesota who were forming the Rebecca Prescott Sherman DAR chapter in 1907. The quilt survives in the collections of the Minnesota Historical Society. The piece of green silk from the dress is in the center of the quilt. During the Revolutionary War, Quakers were generally sympathetic to the Royalist cause. Those supporting the rebellion were promptly disowned by their Orthodox Quaker meetings, leading some to form their own meeting, the Society of Free Quakers. Betsy Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool and her husband John Claypool joined the society in 1785, bringing into that meeting their children, including their daughter Clarissa. Eventually, membership in the society dwindled, and meetings for worship ended in 1832, when Betsy and a descendant of one of the founders, named Wetherill, closed the door to the meeting house for the last time. It still stands at 5th and Arch Streets. However, the society continued as a social and philanthropic organization, and an interesting art pointed stars, which would be easy to make. She demonstrated a very simple way to fold a piece of paper and with one cut produce a perfect 5-pointed star. Reeves Wetherill of the Society of Free Quakers showed an example of this, a sample folded star pattern, at a luncheon meeting in 1963 of the Women's Committee of the Philadelphia Flag Day Association. The pattern for stars has been on display in the old meeting house. Wetherill explained that the folded star pattern came from an old safe which his father had caused to be opened in 1922, and he, as a teenager, had been invited to be present. Reeves Wetherill was a descendant of Samuel Wetherill, one of the founders of the Society of Free Quakers. The artifact has been in the possession of someone associated with the Society of Free Quakers since it was created. On it as follows, in lead pencil: H. C. Wilson, Betsy Ross, and pattern 4 stars. Betsy is spelled S-E-Y, and the H appears to overwrite a W. We can only speculate as to when this pattern for stars artifact was conceived. However, there is evidence that a group of Quaker ladies gathered in 1845 to sew garments for the poor. This date corresponds with a decision by the members of the society to purchase an iron chest in which to protect their records. Since this artifact comes down through the society, it could have been in this very iron chest. The Quaker ladies involved in this charitable activity, and most ladies of the time were accomplished in needlework, could have included Sophia Hildebrand, Betsy's granddaughter. Sophia, with her mother, Clarissa Claypool Wilson, in 1812. Assuming that there was well-established local folklore about Betsy and the origin of the country's first flags, Philadelphia was still a small town, and so people would have all known this, it is quite possible that the conversation among the ladies in 1845 turned to this particular activity. Sophia Hildebrand may have been asked to describe the simple way her mother, Clarissa, and grandmother Betsy Ross had of making 5-pointed stars. With this, a demonstration piece for making a 5-pointed star is produced. When this pattern for stars is created, one of the ladies feels it should be preserved. She intends to note upon it that it represents what Clarissa and Betsy used, and makes a W to start the name Wilson. But before the name is written out, the W is converted to an H for Hildebrand, because Sophia is the one present in the demurs to having her name on the pattern for stars, feeling that her mother's name should be on it, and so the writer goes back to creating the name Clarissa Wilson. C followed by Wilson, spelled out in full. On the next line, writing the name Betsy Ross, spelling Betsy with an S-E-Y, and then follows that with pattern for and then stars. The sample pattern for stars could have found its way into the iron fireproof chest authorized to have been purchased in January of 1847, and all we can say for sure about this sample pattern for stars is that somebody thought it significant enough to preserve, and it remained in the possession of the Society of Free Quakers or a Wetherell descendant from the time it was made until Reeves Wetherell brought it out in 1963. It is a significant artifact in support. We also have art as evidence in the Betsy Ross story. In the U.S. Capitol, there is an interesting piece of evidence has recently come to light from the office of the architect of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. A glass plate negative depicting a proposed fresco that might have been considered for the ladies' waiting room in the Capitol building at that time. In the 1850s, an Italian artist, Constantino Bruniti, was commissioned to create frescoes in the Capitol building. One of his draftsmen produced a rough layout for consideration, and while it was not utilized, the design reflects the folklore of the period regarding important women of the Revolutionary War period. There are 4 images, roughly done, one of which would have been a flat panel, apparently above a door, and 3 others would have been in a 4-part panel on the roof, to a group of 3 men in uniform with a cluster of soldiers in the background. This is not the typical scene of Lady Liberty giving a flag to a single soldier, often found on regimental flags. Instead, it shows a real woman and a group of 3 men, consistent with Betsy's description of the committee, who called on her for a flag. How the artist knew of the story, we do not know. However, the point is that the story was known during the 1850s. The additional images for the ceiling panel, and there were to be 4, but only 3 were drawn, are most likely other women with legendary roles in the American Revolution. Their names are well known to us. Molly Pitcher, who served in her husband's place on a cannon crew during the Battle of Monmouth. Lydia Darrow, the Philadelphia Quakeress spy, who warned Washington of an impending attack at Valley Forge. And Deborah Sampson, who dressed as a man in the Continental Army from May 1782 to October 1783. The 4th panel is blank on the rough drawing, and the fresco was never painted. We don't know why, except that there might not have been any other names that came to mind, and Bruniti went on to something else. Next, we have the Waldo portrait of Betsy in 1832, done in 1832, which supports her as an important figure. The Waldo portrait was brought forward by Dr. Whitney Smith in 1975. The owner of the painting at that time, who wished to remain anonymous, discovered the painting in an antique shop and, suspecting it was more than it appeared to be, bought it. The shop owner, who saw only the frame as valuable and nothing more, was willing to let it go. On the back of Waldo, 32, meaning 1832. The painting depicts an old woman. If it is indeed Elizabeth Claypool, she was 80 years old at the time. The family resemblance is clear when the image is compared to pictures of her children and grandchildren. Samuel Waldo, a well-known New York portrait painter, could have searched out Elizabeth Claypool when she lived with a daughter in Abington, north of Philadelphia. He might have heard of her historical role as Betsy Ross. and felt she was a worthy subject for his brush. The painting is not up to Waldo's normal quality, and as a portrait, he must have retained it in his personal collection. Certainly Betsy's descendants were not aware of it. His interest was therefore more likely historical than commercial, reflecting contemporary traditions about Betsy's important role in the making of. We also have a portrait done in 1851 by Ellie Sully Wheeler of Philadelphia. This portrait is presently owned by Weston Adams, a lawyer in Columbia, South Carolina. It is a painting of Betsy Ross and the Flag Committee done in 1851, some 20 years before William Canby's speech and 42 years before the famous Charles Weisgerber painting. It is Betsy showing the flag with the stars in a circle to Washington, Morris, and Ross. A young girl is in the picture holding the attention of one of the men. The artist was the daughter of a famous Philadelphia painter, Thomas Sully. She had grown up in the neighborhood of Philadelphia where much of this history had occurred. She may have known through folklore the story of Betsy and the committee, and may even have known Betsy herself, as their lives overlapped by some 20 years. The picture was done approximately the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Interestingly, the picture was copied around 1900 by J.L.G. Ferris, a very well-known artist of that period, as a part of his series, Pageant of America. In a way, this establishes its authenticity. It was known and owned by somebody in Philadelphia at that time, and Ferris copied it to compete with the 1893 painting by Charles Weisgerber, which was then making Betsy famous and providing Weisgerber with a living. We finally have a piece of evidence from the Mexican War. Captain Edward Williams has a Mexican War story which gives Betsy credit for the Trenton flag. In February 1896, the Harrisburg Telegraph ran. Edward C. Williams, in his early 20s and a captain at the time of the war with Mexico, raised a company of volunteers in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to go to Mexico with General Scott. His story is told in an official report by Major Brindle, prepared the day after the taking of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City on 15 September 1847. Captain Williams raised an American flag over Chapultepec after he accepted the Mexican surrender. The flag is said to have been brought by Williams from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where he had borrowed it from the State Library. The flag was referred to at that time as the Trenton flag, given to George Washington by Betsy Ross before that battle in 1776. Several other reports filed regarding the military actions in Mexico mention the case. In the interview with the Telegraph, Williams recalled that the flag he borrowed to take to Mexico was one of three from the State Library, the other two being a Hessian flag and a British banner. He said that these were generally believed to have been given to the State Library by Dr. Benjamin Rush. The State Library was in Philadelphia until 1810, and so this recollection is reasonable, although the actual origins of the flag cannot be confirmed. Of interest in this official government document is the extent to which Betsy Ross was associated with the national flag in 1847. In conclusion, we can say that indirect evidence has surfaced in the last 100 years from the time my grandfather's uncles investigated, researched, and wrote their view of the Betsy Ross story, that Betsy influenced or initiated the use of five-pointed stars on the national flag, that she sewed prototypes and actual flags for the Pennsylvania Navy and for the U.S. government, and that her role was appreciated in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and national folklore for generations before her grandson's speech in 1870. While there is no documentary evidence as to who designed and sewed the first national flag, she was in the center of it all during the Revolution and has a defensible place in our nation's history.